Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Husey. I'm Director of Strategic Deterrent Studies here at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies here at the Air Force Association. Thank you for watching this on-demand presentation, which is part of our virtual nuclear triad modernization and deterrent symposium entitled Second to None, Working Together to Modernize America's Nuclear Deterrent. I'm happy to be co-hosting this presentation and symposium with the great people from the Cyber Innovation Center and Louisiana Tech Research Institute. Originally, we had planned to do this conference live, but of course, because of the coronavirus, we are going to do most of it virtual. We are very, very fortunate today to have a colleague and friend of mine, Brad Thayer, who's going to talk to us about China's nuclear strategy and great power competition. Brad is a professor at the University of Texas, San Antonio, and a former fellow at Magdalen College, University of Oxford, and the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. Welcome, Brad. I want to thank you on behalf of CIC, Louisiana Tech Research Institute, and the Mitchell Institute for joining us today. And I'd like to start today's session by giving you an opportunity to make a number of opening remarks with respect to China's nuclear expansion, the Xi Doctrine, as you've called it, and what should be the United States' response to these Chinese developments. So over to you, Professor Thayer.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity, and my thanks as well to Brian, Jeff, and Sean for facilitating my participation today. My talk is entitled China's Strategy and Great Power Competition, and I make three arguments in my allotted time. First, Xi Jinping, the chairman Xi Jinping, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and thus China, is a unique leader and a singular threat to the Chinese people, as well as to America's global interests. Secondly, the prodigious expansion of China's nuclear and conventional capabilities is the result of the Xi Doctrine generated by the Xi Jinping clique in control of China. And the fundamental aim of the Xi Doctrine is to replace the United States as the world's dominant state. Third argument is the threat to U.S. homeland, U.S. allies, and other U.S. interests is a function of both capabilities and intent. I know many of my colleagues have addressed or will address the capabilities of China. I want to explain their motivation, their intent, largely in my discussion today. The growth of the PRC's capabilities has been prodigious, and Beijing's intent is to replace the US. In response, the US has to return to the principles of great power competition. It must adopt measured confrontation with China, and thus the United States should significantly increase its nuclear and conventional presence in the Indo-Pacific, strengthen and augment its allies, and draw the world's attention to the fact that China is the cause of intensified security competition and other dangerous consequences of Xi Jinping's policies. So my first argument, Xi's a unique leader and a singular threat to the Chinese people and American interests. US, particularly those in the American security community, foreign policy communities, and others should recognize that Xi's a unique leader and is a particular danger to the US and the Chinese people. He's determined to be the equal of Mao Zedong and even to exceed Mao Zedong. And so for those of us who are old enough to remember the Cold War, that's particularly alarming. The equal of Mao, both in his impact on the Chinese Communist Party and the country of China, but also to overshadow and reverse Deng Xiaoping's legacy. So Xi is going to ensure the supremacy, is determined to ensure the supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party and its rule, and to continue to force ideological conformity with Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and what Xi calls Xi Jinping thought. His deep insecurity drive him to continue to target rivals, such as Ren Zhikang, who in February 2020 circulated an essay critical of Xi's response to the pandemic, a very critical letter, really, and fundamentally an indictment of the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Ren argued that the pandemic was a cause of the defects of the Communist Party of system. Not unexpectedly, he has since been imprisoned. Xi also ensures that potential rivals, such as Jack Ma, do not come into a position to challenge him, right? The IPO suspension shows that Xi saw him as a rival, and Ma's frank and accurate criticisms of the Chinese banking system and regulations marked him as an enemy of the regime. So Xi moves against domestic opponents to ensure his domination and rule. He moves against states, including the United States, equally. That reveals his ultimate objective for China is to realize, at least purportedly by 2049, that China is the dominant state. And indeed, as China becomes more powerful, Xi's ambitions and actions reflect the fruits of its expanding power. And that should be a cause of great concern for the rest of the world. Under Xi, the PRC is working assiduously to alter, not embrace, the status quo in international politics. Among its many policies to bring about change, it's confronted Japan over a contested territory, the Senkaku Islands. It's declared a new air defense identification zone in the region. It's clashed with India repeatedly over their disputed border. It's threatened Taiwan. It's militarized the PRC's facility in Djibouti. It's created new islands in the South China Sea, and indeed has claimed the bulk, 90% of the South China Sea. And it has the local military power there to enforce its claims absent a US response. It's had a series of incidences of territorial expansion, not just in the South China Sea, but notably as well against the Philippines in Scarborough Shoal on the periphery of the South China Sea, as well as numerous diplomatic clashes with Manila. It additionally has, under Xi's rule, rejected the Permanent Court of Arbitration's 2016 ruling that the PRC was violating international law in the South China Sea. It's contravened the 1984 Hong Kong Treaty with the UK in order to crush democracy in Hong Kong. And in fact, it has de facto, Beijing de facto has ended the one country, two systems arrangement which governed life in Hong Kong. It's imprisoned and forced into coerced labor Uyghur, Kazakh, and Kyrgyz Muslims in concentration camps in Xinjiang. It's abused many of the families of these inmates by requiring them to house and host Han men in order to humiliate not just the family, of course, as horrible as that is, but the people and the religion itself. It's launched a series of new international institutions, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, more recently, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a free trade zone in the Indo-Pacific, which will encompass about a third of global economic output. And it's weaponizing the Belt and Road Initiative and Digital Silk Road to secure lines of communication to Europe, to Southwest Asia, and to Africa. It's expanded its influence in the Arctic and the subarctic, including in Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands. And if Scotland were to become independent, of course, there would be a great concern regarding China's influence in a newly independent Scotland. It also in Melanesia and Polynesia has greatly expanded its influence and has been increasingly assertive in opposing US air and sea operations in the region and beyond as well. Most significantly, China has launched an arms race in conventional nuclear and space weaponry, aggressively expanding its military capability. China's expansion of its nuclear weapons capability has not received the attention that it deserves due to the threat to the ability of the US to deter attacks against the homeland itself, to extend deterrence to its allies, and to protect its global interests. It also is a threat to strategic stability. So strategic stability results when both or all sides in a deterrent relationship have little incentive to race for superiority. We had this really in the denouement of the Cold War, where Gorbachev's Soviet Union and the US agreed to essentially recognize that the strategic situation was a stable one. But that's not going to obtain with China, and it's not for three reasons. First, while the common estimate of Chinese nuclear weapons is approximately 300, due to their lack of transparency, the reality is much larger, as Dr. Mark Schneider has argued, perhaps 2 to 3 times larger than is usually given credit for. And indeed, there have been calls within China among authoritative figures to expand its nuclear arsenal to at least 1,000 strategic warheads, of course, to say nothing of tactical or intermediate range or other forces. So while the US took a strategic holiday in the Cold War, in the aftermath of the Cold War, the PRC has used that opportunity to expand their arsenals as well as cyber and conventional capabilities. And we're realizing that as well. Beijing already has a large and diversified strategic missile force that supports a warfighting posture. The world caught a glimpse of this last year, the October 1st, 2019 military parade, which was the 70th anniversary of the founding of the PRC, where they revealed new systems. Given the considerable effort to create new strategic systems, as well as cyber and conventional capabilities, including DF-21D and DF-26B anti-ship ballistic missiles, inescapable conclusions are, first, that the causes of their expansion is rooted in their grand strategic objectives of achieving hegemony, that is, their intent to achieve hegemony. And secondly, the decision to expand their forces was sown long ago. China has used US strategic passivity to modernize and to grow its arsenal. Even more disconcertingly, China's buildup might allow it to race to parity with the United States, or even attempt to achieve superiority over the United States in the years to come. The second reason is strategic stability won't obtain under Xi's China is that the form of China's buildup is notable. Also, always secretive, the Chinese have occluded their nuclear expansion as they don't want to provoke the US or a US ally's reaction prematurely. But equally damning is that the Chinese are secretly preparing the battlefield to ensure that they have the ability to damage the US and its allies through other non-nuclear and non-kinetic means. These avenues of attack include, of course, cyber, but also areas of trade, supply chain dominance, economic influence and trade insecurity, the problems that the world has witnessed due to the dependence on PPE on China's factories, our dependence on them for pharmaceuticals or ingredients for pharmaceuticals, their attempt at technological mastery, the export of fentanyl and other related and similar narcotics, and the continued legal and illegal access to America's knowledge, intellectual property, its finance, and its technology to facilitate, of course, the expansion of Chinese power. But this penetration is not only about expanding power. These are new attack vectors to hurt the US economy and population, as again evinced in the pandemic. They are executing these measures with the hope that the US could be weakened or damaged sufficiently to cause US political leaders to yield or to have the threat hanging over US decision makers regarding future crises or future problems with China. And then lastly, strategic stability under Xi's China is not going to obtain because China rejects arms control in principle and in practice. Thus far, Beijing will not unilaterally reduce or limit its arsenal or come into arms control talks. And that's a worrisome sign. It suggests that US assumptions about the causes of stability in a great power relationship, modeled really on our experience with the Soviet Union, are only the US's, and they're not shared by China. Arms control, of course, offers the opportunity, at least the potential, to promote stability in relations between states, a state willingly signaling that it's going to limit a class of weapons and thus in accord, and consequently, its ambitions are limited. It supports strategic stability, and all of those are positive aspects of an arms control regime. But China rejects that. It shows that the Chinese are not willing to be fettered, and they're not willing to allow any constraints in the expansion of their nuclear or conventional capabilities. As the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas argued last month, November 2020, he called for Beijing's participation in future arms control agreements as a major nuclear and military power. He stated, Beijing must engage more strongly in arms control, transparency, and risk reduction. Fundamentally, so even the Europeans and significant states like Germany are recognizing the disconnect between the nature of strategic stability as it developed in the course of the Cold War and the present situation where China is taking its independent and very dangerous path. Due to the lack of transparency in China, there are many unknowns about its modernization, its nuclear doctrine, and its ambitions. Its lack of transparency regarding the scope and size of its nuclear modernization weakens strategic stability, as China produces no doubt about the future intentions and commitment in terms of its ambitions. Second major argument I'd like to make concerns the Xi Doctrine. So the Xi Doctrine is the strategy put in place by Xi Jinping. It has domestic components, but also international components, and I'll focus on the international. The objectives of the Xi Doctrine are to use economic, technological, ideological, and diplomatic and military means to expand Chinese power. So we need to recognize the totality of Chinese expansion in each of those areas. Technologically, the China 2025 project and the Digital Silk Road are intended to create the digital 5G infrastructure and develop quantum computing and, of course, artificial intelligence. The ideological component cannot be neglected, right? We can see the Chinese are talking about less about the China dream argument that Xi Jinping advanced and much more towards the common destiny or shared destiny of mankind, which is a way to reach global audiences. The military instrument, of course, has been greatly expanded in support of China's growing alliances as well, which needs to be absolutely noted. The anticipated expansion, for example, of the Y-20 fleet from around 10 now to, as the US-China Commission report stated, to probably within the next decade, 100 to 400 of those aircraft are going to aid Beijing's ability to project power. So Xi has successfully accomplished his ambitions, territorial ambitions, and the expansion of the economic, technological, diplomatic, and military means. What should the US do in response? So my third argument is that the United States should pursue measured confrontation, not collaboration with China. While there have been many appeals for accommodation, accommodation will fail because it requires sufficient mutual interests. Argue that's not the case, that the intent of China is to replace the United States, and accommodation inevitably is going to fail. Xi Jinping's personal motto is show the blade. So let the US take him at his word and adopt his maxim as its animating spirit to defeat his ambitions. To combat his measures, the US has to embrace a policy of measured confrontation. And that means that the US has to be clear about the enemy and how the US is going to achieve victory over its foe. 40 years after the end of the Cold War, Washington once again needs to adhere to the principles of great power competition. Those are first, that there has to be a strategic focus on the enemy and a strategy for victory over the foe. We can be reminiscent of Cato the Elder's argument always in the Roman Senate that Carthago delenda est, that is, Carthage had to be destroyed. His singular focus on the peer competitor to Rome's can animate our situation today. His clear and powerful insight concerning the necessity of focusing upon the enemy, the peer competitive threat, must fuel contemporary US strategic thought. Second principle of great power competition is that power is everything. Power is the coin of the realm in our confrontation with China. And US policy has to be anchored on the understanding that it is indeed the most significant instrument in international politics and for the maintenance of US interests. That again concerns military, economic, technological, even educational power as well. The third principle concerns the distinction between absolute and relative power. While absolute power, of course, of a state is significant, what's much more significant is the relative power of the state, how it ranks in terms of power against the power of other states. Dominant great powers that do not carefully consider and evaluate the relative distribution of power are condemned to lose their dominance. Thus, how relative power is distributed is of central importance. Trade has to be considered. Economic concerns have to be seen through the lens of its impact on relative power. The US needs to abandon the economist's view in the world with respect to absolute gains from trade and the strategist emphasis on how trade and other points of cooperation are going to influence the distribution of relative power has to again come to the fore and be salient. The fourth and final is focused balancing. The US has to possess the correct conventional and strategic force structure in the region as well as globally to deter China. Washington has to stand with its allies and other states. This includes the Quad, Australia, India, and Japan, as well as the US, who are thankfully cooperating more closely and may serve as a nascent counterbalance to the PRC. But the US has to continue to lead them. We've seen positive elements there with the Indo-American 2+2 ministerial in October 2020. Joint, obviously, naval exercises, the Malabar naval exercise involving Australian, Indian, Japanese, and US forces are all very significant, but they have to be sustained and further developed and deepened. FONOPs need to continue, and it's a very positive sign that Britain will be sending next year. A very positive sign first that Britain has been particularly active in FONOPs between 2018 and 2020, and in 2021, London plans to send the Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group into the South China Sea. In conclusion, unfortunately for stability in international politics and for the security of US interests, China's determined and dramatic increase underscores, first, that China's ambitions are not limited, but are expansionistic. Second, that it rejects strategic stability by undertaking a secretive and accelerated growth of every aspect of its conventional and its strategic arsenal. Unabated, this unprecedented growth is inevitably going to require a response from its neighbors. India, obviously, from Tokyo as well. If there are doubts about the American commitment, we should certainly expect to see a nuclear Japan in the years to come. Notably, China could avoid this. China could convey that it's a status quo power if it would restrain itself. But the fact that it does not, and that it could indeed achieve greater security by working within the present international order rather than overturning it, but it refuses to do so. And so a cleared eye, and it refuses to do so due to the Olympian ambitions of its leaders. So that refusal needs to be heeded by global communities and US strategic interests in particular. Our problem is the unrivaled growth of the PRC's capabilities and the concomitant expansion of their ambition, particularly under Xi Jinping. Measured confrontation will allow us to sustain very important capabilities over the Chinese at present, and an alliance structure that gives us the ability to work to contain China's ambitions. As regrettable as it is, the traditional tools of great power competition, direct, focused, and measured confrontation, is necessary and the only option available to the United States and its allies to defeat Xi Jinping's ambitions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Brad, that was an excellent introduction to your remarks. Let me start with a question that you've answered in part, and that is, we will probably have a new administration in Washington, D.C. What would be the impact of adopting a policy of echoing the new National Security Advisor's, he's been chosen, has said, if China's more powerful, that's good for America because we want China to be successful. I don't know whether that includes, I would assume, economic, militarily, political. The question is, what's your sense of what impact will that have, that kind of a policy, if adopted?
Thank you, Peter. That's an excellent question. My response to that is that this reflects, if you will, the thinking of the old regime. The thinking that if we cooperated with China and facilitated its growth, brought China into the international system, and let China prosper, it would adopt Western values, democracy, free market. And what have we witnessed empirically? There's no evidence for that. Empirically, China's totalitarianism has strengthened. The Chinese crony capitalism has strengthened. So to make arguments that would accommodate China in the hope that we could go back to the situation as it was for most of the post-Cold War period, where the United States accepted the rise of its peer competitor, which is a historically unique condition in international politics. The United States facilitated the rise of its enemy, and it still does, right? With the penetration of the Chinese, even in our financial markets, in our capital markets, we still have not separated. We're funding the PLA in essence, which is strategic. We could say that is a gross strategic mistake. It's perhaps the greatest grand strategic mistake the US has ever made, right? Time will tell. But we need to stop facilitating the rise of our peer competitor, our foe, our enemy, and confront our enemy. And to do that, we need confrontation, no more accommodation of China. If we do not do that, then we will see very rapidly our relative power change in disfavor. We will very rapidly see US power decline and Chinese power increase even more so than it is. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Brad. Just to mention that recently, over the last month, the president has issued 2 executive orders on policy prohibiting us from investing in Chinese companies that are listed on our stock exchanges, which have a relationship to the Chinese military. You're very right in terms of we basically were funding the growth of a military which is aimed at our American people and our soldiers, which was crazy, as you have pointed out. With respect to that, many critics of, I guess we would call ourselves Chinese hawks to some degree, have said that the Chinese only have a limited number of nuclear weapons, somewhere around 300, and therefore they don't need to be part of any arms control agreement or discussion or be transparent even. Lay out, if you would, a little bit more detail on why does the PRC reject not only discussing arms control and being part of an agreement, but actually having no transparency with respect to their nuclear weapons and their nuclear policy.
Thank you, Peter. A very important issue. The Chinese do that because they see, as traditional Marxist, Leninist, Maoists, that there's no willingness to share with the opponent. There's no willingness to share capabilities because their objectives are to overthrow the present order. So they're, in principle, they're not willing to share information. We should keep in mind that the estimates of approximately 300 are, while generally accepted, right, the strength of their arsenal is likely to be much larger than that. But the arsenal is only one component. We should expect as well the nuclear infrastructure that the Chinese have has greatly expanded, as recently has been pointed out. And Bill Gertz's reporting, for example, on this has been outstanding. So the possibility of greatly increasing the arsenal that they possess, even assuming that it's low, which again is questionable, is quite alarming. Moreover, their interests globally are expanding. So China is going to require robust extended deterrent commitments to deal with its new allies in South Asia, in Africa, and elsewhere. So that also will require the growth of the Chinese nuclear arsenal and even the precipitous growth of the Chinese nuclear arsenal. So they reject arms control in principle, really for reasons of Maoism, for reasons of their orientation. And in practice, they reject it because they don't want to be fettered. They don't want to be controlled, given that their ambitions are, as I describe them, Olympian. Their ambitions are to overthrow the present order and replace it with their own, with China at top. We would also note that the avenues of competition are not just strategic. So even if their size of their arsenal is rather low, in comparison to a Russian arsenal, for example. The other avenues of competition, supply chain dominance, right? Trade and economic security, the way the Chinese have penetrated that, the way they've penetrated intellectual capital, the way they've penetrated universities, is also an avenue, not just to extract knowledge, to siphon off knowledge, but also serves as a key point of vulnerability in Western societies, including US societies, which they may exploit as well. So recognizing that the threat is multifaceted, we can recognize that arms control with the PRC is going to be feckless in practice, and in reality, it's quite likely to be absolutely come to no fruition whatsoever for the unwillingness of the Chinese to engage in it. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Let me go to the next question, which flows logically from what you just said. With the new administration, one thing I've noticed, if you go back over the last 30 some odd years, our adversaries often attack us or do something at the end of an administration or the very beginning of a new administration when we are less able to respond. The USS Cole, for example, was attacked right at the end. We had the 1993 World Trade Center bombing in February of 1993. We have a system where we have a president and then kind of a lame duck until January, and then the new president takes over and they don't get their people in place for some time. With respect to the Middle East and Iran, particularly the Iran nuclear deal, Taiwan, and North Korea. Those are three areas where the Chinese have a critical role to play if they wanted to play a positive role. But as you know, we're worried about their aggression in Taiwan. With respect to North Korea, it's being unwilling to really undo the nuclear program, which they put in place in large part. And then the Middle East, the question is the extent to which they're using Iran as an ally. Could you lay out what your concerns are if you were advising the new administration come January, February, March, what the Chinese might do in these three areas?
Absolutely. Again, a very salient issue. We would recognize, of course, that the Chinese typically favor surprise. That is, they favor surprise attacks against their opponents. And thus, as you observed, at any transition period, that's a particularly acute time. We could think also of the EP3E incident in April 2001 at the beginning of the Bush administration. And 2012, Scarborough Shoal, right, during Obama's, the last year, obviously, of his first term, while we were in election season in the United States. We should expect that the Chinese will act with surprise, and they will act expeditiously. And thus, assumptions that we have about a strategic timeline in China, heavily colored by Deng Xiaoping's arguments about how China is going to be developing over time, and it doesn't pose a threat to the rest of international society. That was a ruse. China has a very active strategic timeline. It is moving assiduously to bring about change in international politics. It's quite willing to use force against the Indians, conceivably in a coup, against Taiwan. The expeditionary capabilities of the Chinese are growing, so we should expect greater support for Iran, greater support for Pakistan, and other allies that China possesses. So with respect to advice, there are two major points. One, don't mirror image. The Chinese strategic timeline is not the US's. The Chinese are seeking to overturn an international order. The United States is seeking to preserve it. So fundamentally, we're in opposition. Second key piece of advice is that when we examine the use of force, their willingness to execute preventive wars, their willingness to execute preemption, their willingness to engage in surprise attack, the empirical record is clear. The Chinese do this all of the time. And sadly, we do not have the right conventional force posture in the region, and we do not have the right strategic posture in the region. Clearly, there are steps to address that, but they have to be sustained, and that gap has to be addressed by the new administration as rapidly as possible. Thank you, Peter.
Let me follow up. Your question is, what are the things, both strategically and conventional, that you think the new administration should do to close that gap? And in particular, would you address the question of if the United States unilaterally significantly cut back its own nuclear modernization program, how would that affect our relationship with China and China's willingness to use force against us and our allies if we would do something unilaterally, like get rid of the land-based leg of the Triad or the cruise missiles, both of which have been on the table within the arms control community and people selected to be in the new administration?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, we need to recognize that the United States was able to create very effective strategic and conventional deterrence against the Warsaw Pact. And the United States was able to do that for many reasons, but it had great allies who were willing to assist it, just as we do today. But it also ensured that it had the ability to meet Warsaw Pact aggression at any level in the escalation ladder, very significantly. We need to adopt that page out of the Cold War playbook. Right now, we do not. So what do we need to do? We need to not only sustain, if you will, our arsenal and the Triad, other aspects, but we also need to expand it as well. We need to have, obviously, intermediate range ballistic missiles and medium range, short range, obviously, as are being developed. We need to have a greater number of tactical nuclear weapons as well. And we need to have the conventional force posture, Air Force, naval assets, Marine assets, clearly, and indeed Army assets in the region to provide a very robust conventional deterrent capabilities. Any cuts are only going to embolden China's ambitions. They're only going to accelerate China's willingness to push us. So what we need is, again, to adopt that very Cold War playbook, a very robust conventional and a theater, a tactical theater, as well as strategic capabilities, so that if the Chinese have no incentive whatsoever to escalate, to attack in the first place, or to escalate an attack if one were to occur. So we don't have that now. We need to address it. If we do not address it, the Chinese will take advantage of our weakness. And our allies will recognize that the United States will not stand with them, that the United States is weakened and its commitment is subject to doubt. And then we will see a bad situation get even worse with respect to India moving in its own path, Japan and others, perhaps seeking to accommodate, reach their own agreements with China if the United States is not there to back them and to serve as a manager in a potential alliance. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Brad. I want to move to a question raised by Dr. Kissinger recently, that he said the only options with respect to China are cooperation or conflict. And conflict, he said, would be military and would be a disaster. So one of the questions I had talked to you about previously is, why are those, particularly in the West, reject confrontation with the Chinese? You've talked about managed confrontation. Why do they seek accommodation? Is it that they see the alternative is inevitably to be conflict, which would just harm both of us? Or given the Chinese 1.4, 1.3 billion people, their rise is inevitable? I often hear that someone the other day said that there's some things you just can't stop in the world, and this apparently is one of them. So could you address this issue of, similar to the Iranian nuclear agreement, the option was, we were told, either make this deal tough as it is because it doesn't deal with missiles or human rights, or it pauses their nuclear program rather than ends it. That's our only choice versus go to war. Mm-hmm. That was the
Yes.
narrative that we had. And that's the narrative we have with respect to China. Would you address that?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I think Kissinger's remarks are a symptom of a profound problem in our strategic thought in the United States. And that is that we're unable to recognize that we do indeed have an enemy. We do indeed have foes. And we need to develop a strategy for victory over our enemies and over our foes. It is a false dilemma to say that, well, there's cooperation or we're going to have to fight a war, a nuclear war with China. There are many, nothing is deterministic. And so the framing that false dilemma is a way of encouraging continued cooperation, the continuation of a bad idea which remains with us, an idea that we've had throughout the post-Cold War period, that we can cooperate with China, we're going to bring them in, we're going to change China, and everybody is going to be better off, right? Again, an economist's view of the world, not a strategist's view of the world. How we came to that is lamentable, but here we are. So what's necessary is to reject that advice, right? The Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm, right? So the strategist needs to come in and say, well, let's no longer do any more harm to the United States. Let's abandon the idea of cooperation with China, recognize that it is a foe, that it is an enemy, and we need to confront it. Confronting it, as we've discussed, right, many elements that we need to do in cooperation with our allies, our own force structure, our strategic, conventional, et cetera, that we need to do. But that gives us the ability to deter possible Chinese expansion or continued Chinese expansion. And it also gives us the ability to reassure our allies that the United States is there with us. So strength is going to be met with greater cooperation from our allies, and including even expanding alliance relationships. Weakness of the United States is only going to encourage the deterioration of US interests and the continued growth of the ambitions of our foes. Certainly China, but Peter, you're exactly right to point out the regional aspect of Iran, right? That as China's power grows, it has more allies, and those allies are also able to target US interests regionally, as indeed Iran is, as well as other states. So that's a quite alarming development that has to be met. Strength allows deterrence. Strength both in terms of the military capabilities, but also the political component, a willingness, right? Credibility, all are absolutely salient for establishing deterrent. If we have those, the military capabilities wedded to the political intent, the United States is going to be able to resist China's challenge and indeed defeat China. If we do not, there's no possibility of defeating China, and the world will be in a much worse place if China were to run it.
Well, Brad, I want to thank you for those sobering thoughts. They're necessary, and I want to thank you on behalf of the Mitchell Institute of Aerospace Studies and the Cyber Innovation Center and Louisiana Tech Research Institute, our co-hosts for this symposium, which we want to thank you for being part of. It's been extraordinary to have your thoughts on China. Your remarks, of course, will be posted on December 10th when the conference goes live. And I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for extraordinary remarks, very informative. And we look forward to working with you again when we do our next symposium, which is going to be scheduled tentatively for July 2021, again in Crane, Indiana, where we have done it twice before with the United States Navy. Again, Brad, thank you so much on behalf of all of us for your outstanding remarks.
Thank you, Peter. My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation and allowing me to participate.
Thank you, sir.